As I've stated in one of my earlier videos, Final Fantasy is huge. And with such a huge series comes some questions from new players that are feeling maybe a little intimidated by the whole thing. So I've rounded up a few of them and will answer them from my own experience with the series. And two things of note. Firstly, this is going to be a multiple part series because I don't want to make an hour-long video and bore all of you. And secondly, these are answers from my own experiences. My experiences with the series may be vastly different from yours, or maybe they're the same. People's experiences will differ from each and every aspect of each and every game. So let's just jump into this. So this one's almost a meme at this point, but the question will always remain, why do some of the numbers in Final Fantasy equal different games? Or basically, why is Final Fantasy 2 actually Final Fantasy 4, and so on and so forth, and blah blah blah. So I think it would be best if I use some sort of graphical chart, but here's the problem, I haven't made it yet, so I gotta make it real quick. So the first Final Fantasy was released in 1987 in Japan. Due to slow localization times, and some time spent to see how it would perform sales-wise in Japan before releasing to a different audience, it was in the US by 1990. But by this time, Final Fantasy 2 and 3 were already out in Japan. There was a small attempt to release Final Fantasy 2 for NES in the States, and I've got a video about that coming out real soon, so stay tuned. But it fell through. When Final Fantasy IV was released in Japan for the brand new Super Famicom, Square knew a brand new Final Fantasy game on a brand new console would probably be good to bring to a new audience. So Final Fantasy IV was released in the States, and being the only game out at the time was Final Fantasy I, it got renamed to Final Fantasy II. And pretty much the same happened with Final Fantasy V and VI. By the time Final Fantasy VII was out, all the numbers were finally corrected, and boy, we were all confused. Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 7... I think we missed something. But there was a screenshot stating Final Fantasy V would be out in America as Final Fantasy III, and I found it. It is here. So that's super neat. I see this one a lot, and no, every single Final Fantasy title, they're completely disconnected from each other. With the exception of anything with a 2 at the end of it, like a 10-2 or 13-2. Those are direct sequels, essentially. Well, more so story extensions than sequels, but you get the point. The real debate there is whether any of the sequel games like those are any good. So no, the short answer is you can jump in and start playing from any point in the series. So I think that this question kind of piggybacks off the last one, and I think it's an important one to ask also. Because no, the stories aren't connected in any way for the most part, but there are some things that are still in common that link them together, mainly different concepts, and that sounds very... Let me explain. For the first 7 games, the UI is essentially the same. Boxes and menus that display stats, commands, all that good stuff. In a standard battle, your party is on the right, enemies on the left. The setup is the same. Just about every Final Fantasy has a similar setup, and some camera angles in the 3D ones later on still hint at that idea. But with the roaming 3D camera, it's not just limited to a right or left setup. And also, let's talk about menus. Every Final Fantasy has a different menu setup. The only thing that differs about each one are the exclusive abilities and commands that change with each iteration of the different games. Those types of things are in common, so therefore the only difference between the games is the story and the way you learn things. That way there are some similarities between worlds that are vastly different. Does that make any sense? I don't know. Also, there are a lot of the same creatures that exist within the world, like chocobos, moogles, various summons, and the inclusion of ultimate weapons for each character. And as always, you can expect the soundtracks to be absolutely breathtaking, whether the game is good or not. There are quite a few more smaller things you'll find here and there, such as the fight between good and evil, but this will at least give you some idea of what to expect when you start one of these games up for the first time. Why even play this series at all? What are the selling points? Well, this one vastly differs between fans. If you ask 10 different fans this question, you'll get 10 different responses. I can only answer this one from my own viewpoint. As someone who loves the series, I want everyone to love the series just as much, but that's never gonna happen. Some people aren't into the idea of a turn-based RPG, which, can we just land on that for a second? Chess, checkers, baseball, football, basketball, Go Fish, even Truth or Dare are all turn-based. So why hate them just because they're in video game form? I don't know, just a thought I had. But maybe people aren't into a fantasy setting, or maybe it's the long stories. There's a lot of reasons that could go on forever. I personally play the series because of the stories and the gameplay. I like to see what each new Final Fantasy game brings to the table to upgrade from the last one. And if I'm speaking honestly, not every Final Fantasy game is a good one. I didn't personally like 12 or 13 that much, but I'll still play them. I'm still glad I have them in my collection. But not every fan is like that. Sure, we all have some sort of brand loyalty or whatever you want to call it, but some fans just keep the ones they like, and that's perfectly fine. Some fans are just vaguely familiar or not at all familiar with everything that came before Final Fantasy X, and that's perfectly fine. The whole point is to simply enjoy the games. Period. That's it. I just think the storytelling in this series stands out among the rest. This one's a little more difficult to answer. Upon first thought, I immediately wanted to say yes, they're all sort of vaguely similar in their difficulty. I don't think that any of them are more difficult than the other one, I just think that there are different ways to handle different strategies and different creatures, that sort of thing. Gameplay differs among the games, especially after Final Fantasy X, so that question isn't exactly a fair one. In Final Fantasy XIII, you have to learn how to paradigm shift on the fly during battles and still choose menu commands, versus Final Fantasy IX, which has the traditional turn-based menus. It's not any more difficult, it's just different. In almost every game, there's some sort of super boss that may or may not be more difficult than the other super bosses, but the idea is the same. Level up until you're overpowered and kill it. Oh, and difficulty can also come in the form of time spent doing something. For instance, if it takes 1,000 hours to become powerful in the game, it'll seem like a much more difficult task than if it only took an hour or so, when in fact just took longer. So again, I don't know if any of them are more difficult than the other, they're just vastly different in some regards. These are just some of the questions that I've asked around or found on various forums or comment sections. Like I said at the top of the video, there are a lot more, but for right now, I think the answers I've presented here will answer some of the more broad questions about the series as a whole. I'd love to make more of these, so if you have any questions about the Final Fantasy series, please leave them in a comment below and I'll compile them into a video later on. And lastly, did you ever notice in Final Fantasy VI that the opera pretty much tells the story of the game up to the halfway point, including a bouquet of flowers being tossed off a balcony? If not, this video will blow your mind.